on. I'm going to ask you to do one thing before we start. And that is, if you've got a bulletin on the back of it, just draw a line, just like a blank line. And I'll get to that in a little bit. In the world in which we live, there are substitutions for everything. And that's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit today. I remember growing up, and whenever I was growing up, my dad ate butter. He didn't eat margarine, he ate butter. We had margarine in the house, but Dad ate butter. He said, I don't want any of that other grease. He just wouldn't have it. He wouldn't even consider it. It was butter or nothing. Of course, being kids, since Dad liked butter, we like margarine. It was easier to spread. But yet, as I got older, we haven't bought a stick of margarine for I don't know how many years. It's all butter or nothing. But you think about all of the different substitutions that we make today. And I just listed a few, this morning, whenever I actually, and this is a rare occasion, but I actually fixed my wife a bowl of cereal. I cooked it and everything. No, I just poured it out. But I put on mine whole milk. I want the real thing. On hers, she had to have that almond milk on hers. Have you read the label on what almond milk's got in it? I don't know how many almonds it takes to get a gallon of milk, but according to that label, probably not very many because it's got all this other stuff in it. And I said, I think I'll just stick with the one that says milk and vitamin D2 or something like that. I'll just stick with that. But then you think of, some people have to have artificial sweetener. I understand that. Praise God, I can still eat sugar. And with the sweet tooth I've got, I'll probably be on artificial sweetener before I die. But, we got substitutions for everything. Mrs. Dash, although that's a sexist name. If you can't have salt, it gives you a little flavor. So we have a substitute for that. In building supplies, we see a lot of vinyl, and we see a lot of plastic in the replacement of wood. Some places it works really good. It doesn't give you the warm feel of wood, but then it doesn't rot and decay like wood does either. I think of this past year, look at all the plexiglass that was sold, so that you can have a little stand up in front of your desk or in front of, I don't know how many of those things I built around for different people so that they could keep you out and keep your germs to yourself, or just let them splatter there on the glass. A lot easier to work with than just regular glass. Pretty handy stuff. But what about in our spiritual life? And I'm going to hit you on this one. Sometimes we substitute silence for praise. You ever been caught doing that? Yeah, I have. Maybe we tip instead of tithe. Maybe we think about God instead of giving him our time. Or maybe we, instead of being active, we donate to the cause. All those have a place. But the one that gets me more than anything else, the one substitute that I hate more than anything else, is this one. Hugs, made out of chocolate instead of just regular chocolate or just regular hugs. I have missed that. Haven't you? Maybe not. Maybe you don't like being hugged by an old man. Here you go, good catch. Share. But, we substitute so many things. And sometimes it is a necessity. And sometimes it's just a convenience. And what can happen is what I want to talk about today, and it's something that has happened since the beginning of time, actually since the first sin in the Garden of Eden, is we substitute the things of God and we place in the things of ourselves. And I want to read a passage of Scripture out of Romans, the first chapter, start with. Starting with verse 18, and we'll read through the end of the chapter, but I'm going to stop at verse 25 for a second. I believe there's a time that we give to God, and I believe there's also a time that we also have to work things out. Our problem is when the more we work it out instead of actually giving to God, the easier it is to not give to God as often. Verse 18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds, and of four-footed animals, and crawling creatures. Therefore, God gave them over in the lust of their hearts to impurity, that their bodies might be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Just keep your finger right there for a minute. Paul is addressing the church in Rome, and he is saying that here, since the beginning of time, mankind has taken the things of God that they knew about and exchanged them for the things of man. They have served the creation more than they have the Creator. Now, he talked about making idols and things of worship in the form of birds and of animals and of four-footed and two-footed creatures. But he's also not just talking about those who create an image like the golden calf. Go back to Moses' time. Think about this for just a second. They've just come out of Egypt. They've come through all of the plagues. They have come through the Red Sea on dry ground while the water is walled up on both sides of them. The army of Egypt is chasing them, and they have come up clearly, dryly, securely on the other side of the Red Sea, stepped off out of the sea while the army was in hot pursuit, and at that time, God pulled the waters back and completely destroyed the Egyptian army that was out to kill. It wasn't any time later that they went to the mountain and Moses went up to talk to God, and he didn't come down when they thought he should. So they took some of the gold that they had taken from Egypt, and they brought it to Aaron, and he formed a golden calf, and that was their God. I mean, think about that. Where was that God during all of the plagues? Where was that God whenever they were going through the Red Sea? He wasn't there, but yet they were willing to accept this golden image in the place of the true God. And yet, this is nothing new. I mean, it really isn't anything new. We would rather it's easier to serve the creation more than it is the Creator. Because when you serve the creation, There are no rules. There are no guidelines. There are no have-tos. You can kind of make them up as you go. Now, one thing to keep in mind in this is these were all God-fearing, God-knowing people, at least when they started out. At least when they started out. But they were willing to take what they knew was not right and put it in the place of God. Now, if you want, for instances in the Bible, just go to the book of Judges. This was God's chosen people who were brought into the promised land, was given houses that he didn't build and vineyards they didn't plant and fortified cities and given great victory by God. And the people, if you read through the book of Judges, you can start any place and you'll see that they served God for a while and then they just kind of started substituting other things for God until they completely fell away. It wasn't that they didn't know God, but they had just lost sight of him during that time because they were making substitutions for God. And after they had gotten so far and they started getting oppressed by the enemies around them, that they would finally realize that, oh no, we're in trouble. And so they'd call out to God, and God would raise up a deliverer or a judge, and he would rule the people and he would give them victory, and then the people would go back to serving God as long as that judge was alive. As long as he or she lived, they would serve God. And as soon as that judge died, they just started plugging in all these substitutions for the things of God. Until what happened? 40 years later, maybe 20 years, maybe a little longer, maybe a little less, they found themselves right back where they were before. And the cycle just repeated itself and repeated itself and repeated itself all the way through. And it's just the tendencies of mankind to do that. That whenever everything's going good, I don't need God so much so that I can plug something else in his spot. You know, I don't know how many of you have been watching the Kirk Cameron revival campfires or not, but one point that was made up the other night, and it was from a guy who has been studying, you know, the Christian history of our country, and he says revival doesn't come during good times. It always comes during the harshest times. It comes whenever there's the most persecution, whenever there's most pestilence, when there's the most troubles. That's whenever revival comes. Because you really don't need God that much as long as everything's going good. And I think this is what Paul is talking about. It has happened here. Now then, what is the result of just plugging in our own desires in the place of where we really know we should be doing something for God? We should be worshiping God. We should be serving God. We should be doing something, but yet, let's just this once, we'll make an exception. And that worked out so well. Let's make another exception. And let's make another exception. What happens? Read with me from starting with verse 26. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions. For their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. And in the same way also, the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another. Men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to depraved mind to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them. Now, when you start looking at all the things here that Paul is talking about, all of the ways that people have strayed from God, you just think, well, you know, those are just evil people. They were just bad people to start with. But he never said that. Paul said these were people who knew about God from the beginning, but they just kept straying away. They just kept plugging something else in his spot in their life until all of a sudden they lost their standard. They lost their main goal. They lost the moral compass that they had once had. And whenever they lost their moral compass, then all of a sudden, some of these things that, were just terrible to them at one time started getting to where they were, well, maybe not so bad. I won't judge, and I'll just be more understanding until all of a sudden it goes from trying to be understanding to accepting. And then it goes from accepting to promoting. And you think, well, how could that happen? How could that happen? If you lose your compass, if you lose your standard, if you lose your model of what things are supposed to be, you start losing focus. Let me give you a for instance. This is maybe far out. My old truck. It's got all the luxuries of 1968. No air conditioning. It does have windows that roll down. And in the summertime, I'll drive that thing, and as long as I drive it every day, it can be 90 degrees out, 100 degrees out, and both windows down, those little floor vents opened up after the dust and the leaves get through being blown out of them. You don't notice the heat because you've gotten used to it. You don't notice the fact that the noise because you've gotten used to it, because 60 mile an hour, which is about top speed, going down the highway creates a lot of noise. Plus the old truck makes a lot of noise on its own. You don't notice the fact that you don't have a radio hooked up. I've got a radio in it now, but it's not hooked up. But why hook it up? Couldn't hear it anyway. But you get used to it until you get into the new truck that has air conditioning, that is quiet, that rides a whole lot better, drives down the road a whole lot easier, and you can actually listen to what's on the radio. You don't notice all those things that you're just putting up with because you don't have anything else to compare it to. But whenever you have something, a higher standard to compare it to, and if I drive my new truck several days in a row and then get back in the old Chevy, it takes me a couple of days to get back used to it. It does. Now then, take that in your spiritual life. We plug everything else into God's place and to God's time and our time with God, and it doesn't take long till we're not noticing it. But whenever we are faced with the standard that God has placed for us, then all of a sudden it sticks out. It becomes noticeable. And it is sometimes shocking. I want to give you an example out of the Bible, out of the book of Ecclesiastes, of how you can just start plugging in things from yourself, from your own desires, and how it changes you, and how it changes your perspective, how it changes your outlook. The book of Ecclesiastes, as I understand, was written by Solomon. Most all of it was attributed to Solomon. If you remember, Solomon was a son of David and Bathsheba. He became the king right after David. Whenever Solomon became king and God appeared to him, he says, ask anything that you want, and I'll give it to you. And Solomon, in great humility, says, Lord, just give me the wherewithal and the wisdom to rule this great people of yours. That's all he asked for. And God appeared to him again, and he said, because you didn't ask for peace or prosperity, I'm going to give you peace during your entire lifetime. Because you did not ask for prosperity, I'm going to make you the richest king of all time. But because you asked for wisdom, there will never have been or ever be a wiser man than you. So Here you've got a king who has got it all. He's got the wisdom that people are just amazed at. He's got peace. He's got prosperity. He's got plans. He's got everything. But because he started marrying all these other women from all these other countries and bringing their religion in with them, and because he started getting sidetracked with his time with God, with all those other pagan religions, he lost his focus. He lost his purpose. Read with me first 11 verses of chapter 2. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure. So enjoy yourself, and behold, it too was futility. I said of laughter, it is madness, and of pleasure, what does it accomplish? I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine, while my mind was guiding me wisely, and how to take hold of folly, until I could see what good there is for the sons of men to do under heaven for the few years of their lives. I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself, and I planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made ponds of water for myself from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves, and I had homeborn slaves. Also, I possessed flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. Also, I collected for myself silver and gold, and the treasure of kings and provinces. I provided for myself male and female singers, and the pleasures of men, many concubines. Then I became great and increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me, and all that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labor, and this was my reward for all my labor. Thus I considered all my activities which my hands had done, and the labor which I had exerted, and behold, all was vanity and striving after the wind, and there was no profit under the sun. I've done it all. I've had it all. I've experienced it all. I've witnessed it all. I participated in it all. There's nothing that I haven't done that if I just so desired to do it, I just jumped in and did it. And he says, whenever I got done and looked back, he says, it's all like striving after the wind. It was all vanity. It was all for naught. It seemed like it satisfied at the time, but yet it left me so empty inside. It left me without. Why did he do that? Because the thing that he knew he was supposed to be doing for God and with God, he started substituting just a little something else. It's not that he was a bad person. It was just that he got off track. And he started substituting too many of the things that God had in store for him with something else. Now then, why do I bring this up? As we look at what Paul wrote there, that once the people got so far away from God that they give themselves over to all the lusts and passions and all the degraded, activities that your mind just can't hardly imagine. Just look at our country, for example. The more we've taken God out, the more things that have cropped up. The more things that seems like it just is trying to lead us further and further away from God. We used to have gays and lesbians. Now we've got a whole community and it takes up half the alphabet. And the people who have no part of it are critical of anybody who's critical of it and endorsing it. Why is that? Because it justifies their own lifestyle. It justifies their own lifestyle that they know is not right either. So if you can justify somebody who's worse than you, or who you want to say is just different than you, then all of a sudden you're justified in whatever you do too. And the reason they want to do that is because they've lost the standard. They've lost what God had in store for us. It's not that any of them, I repeat, it's not that any of them are bad people. It's just that little by little, they started substituting other things in the place of God. Now, I know that, summertime's coming and we all get busy. And I do not want this in any way, shape, or form to sound like you can't miss church or you're going to hell. I don't want that at all. This is not what it's about. It's about being careful with what you substitute in the place of God. Get your bulletins out. And on the back, I just want you to fill in the blank. When I substitute my time or my service to God, I usually do fill in your blank. And everybody's just going, I don't want to do that. Mine is work. I'll be honest with you. Mine is work. I get wrapped up in my work sometimes that I'm not doing what I should be doing for God. I'll admit it. I'll be honest. And I think if we study that question and study that blank there, we might have something that we know we could put down. And this is just for you. This is not, we're not going to take a poll later and see who put down what. But the only thing I'm suggesting is whenever we're honest with God and we fill in that blank, whether it's with ink or whether it's just in our head, let's be alert of that so that we can be careful with that, so that we can guard against it. Because the last thing we want to do is to keep putting other things in that place of God to where pretty soon we've kind of lost track of who God is. Because whenever you're spending time with God and you're spending time in God's house and spending time with God's people, you form that experience, that bond. You form that kind of standard of who you should be and what you should be in God's eyes, not in man's, but in God's eyes. And the less time we spend with God and the less time we spend with his people, the less time we spend doing his stuff, we're all that time being exposed to the rest of the world who's trying to, even if we don't think we are, they're influencing us. They're making a difference on us. Parents, grandparents, whenever you put something in God's place, have a good reason so that your kids will understand it. Because they're going to form their own list as they get older and step out on their own as to, I can put this in God's place this time. Or this makes it understandable. This makes it right. Because it's not putting God second, it's just having to do something else every once in a while. Jesus said, I didn't make man for the Sabbath, but I made the Sabbath for man. And Jesus, according to the religious people, broke the Sabbath because he ministered to people during that time. There was times he had to do things that, other than what was considered typical, because that's what was needed. We have opportunities and we have things that sometimes we just need to do it. We need to be there. We need to be supportive. We need to be reaching out. But if we're not careful, the importance of what we can fill in for the time with God becomes less important. We can start compromising that too much. And then we're, without even knowing it, without even realizing it, we're losing sight of the big picture. We're losing sight of the standard. Now, again, this is not, you got to be in church or boy, you're in trouble. But it's about making sure that we don't get too comfortable putting other things in God's place, in God's timing, and making sure that we stay focused on where we should be with Him, what we should be doing with Him. Now, this is easy for me to say because, I'm in church every Sunday. It's my job. But I realize that it's not that easy for most people. And I'm not critical of that at all. But over the years, I've watched too many times where good people started making excuses for this and for that, and then for this, and then for that. And then, where'd they go? Where did they go? And whenever you really look into their life, not only did they trade what they were doing on Sunday mornings, for example, or most Sunday mornings, or some Sunday mornings, they started also compromising their beliefs on other things. Why? Not because they're bad, but because that's the influence they've been witnessing. How many times have you caught yourself saying something that your parents used to say to you? Where did that come from? Did it sink in even though you didn't think it would? How many times have you vowed, I'll never do that because my mom or my dad used to say that to me all the time and I thought it was the stupidest thing in the world? And then you hear it come out of your own mouth. Where did that come from? We are influenced by those that we're around the most. So all I'm saying is be careful. Be careful with our choices. I'm speaking this to myself as well as anybody else. Be careful with our choices. And be careful with that one thing that maybe you wrote down on your bulletin. Because it will try and lead you astray. That's how the devil works. May not be a bad thing. Most times, if everybody wrote down, I will just about promise that if everybody wrote down something, that every one of them would be a good thing. Until it starts taking the place of God. Until it starts taking all of our time away from God, or our focus from God. Still be a good thing. Remember this, and I'm closing. Choose God. Choose God. Every time you can, choose God. And the reason why is because He chose you. This morning, as we have listened to the Scripture, I pray that we have identified with it enough that we can relate to it and give it something to chew on, if nothing else, for the rest of this week. And we can ask ourselves, Lord, keep me close to you. Help me keep close to you. Wake me up, show me, open my eyes, whatever it needs to take, so that I can see what I'm putting in your place. And help me through this process. As we stand and sing the hymn of invitation this morning, if God's speaking to your heart about any